He shoved her shoulder with the back of his hand like she was nothing. Like she didn't belong there. Like her skin was a threat. The courtroom had gone quiet, too quiet, except for the smug voice of the officer standing tall, uniform sharp, badge shining like a crown. His voice echoed across the cold marble floor as he spoke without looking at her. "You heard me, this row is for law enforcement, not civilians trying to feel important. Take it somewhere else." A few people glanced over their shoulders. A chuckle. A murmur. And she just stood there, still, calm, not because she wasn't shaken, but because she knew something he didn't. Something no one in that room could imagine. That's where it all started. With a shove. A single, public shove. One push that carried decades of systemic weight and centuries of unspoken pain. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about everything that seat represented. He didn't ask her who she was. He didn't look at her credentials. He didn't pause for a second to consider that she might have more authority than him. In his mind, her skin told him all he needed to know. But what he didn't know, was that he had just pushed his own boss. He didn't know that the woman he just humiliated in front of a courtroom full of people wasn't just a decorated officer, she was the chief of police. And not just that. She was his chief. His superior. The one person with the authority to rewrite his future with a single decision. But she didn't react, not immediately. She didn't scream. Didn't cause a scene. She just sat down, 2 rows behind. Quiet. Observing. Letting the courtroom carry on. Letting him speak again. Loud. Confident. Arrogant. As if the world revolved around his badge. Every injustice he buried under reports. Every complaint brushed off with bureaucratic coldness. Every racial slur disguised in procedural language. Every innocent black teenager handcuffed and humiliated. All of it had finally caught up with him in the place he least expected, right there in the echo chamber of justice where he thought he held the upper hand. And the irony? He'd never been safer from consequences than he felt that day. Standing tall, straight-backed, thinking he owned the courtroom, thinking he could treat whoever he wanted like less than human, and walk away with that same old smirk on his face. But what he didn't see was the quiet storm behind the badge he tried to belittle. A storm years in the making. She had watched officers like him rise through the ranks her entire career. Men who learned to play the system, who wore their badges like armor and used it like a weapon. She had endured the smirks, the closed-door meetings, the condescending jokes about her natural hair, about her tone, about how angry she looked when she simply stood her ground. And she never let them break her. Not once. She climbed the ladder step by step, slow but steady, building a record so clean it couldn't be ignored. And now she was here. At the top. But still pushed like a nobody in front of a courtroom full of strangers. What made this worse? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Cold. Calculated. He didn't see her as someone worth respect. Not because of what she did, but because of who she was. A black woman in a space he thought belonged only to people who looked like him. He pushed her not because she didn't have authority. He pushed her because he assumed she never could. And that's what changed everything. She had come to that courthouse for something else entirely. A separate case. A matter of oversight. But what happened that day shifted her focus. What started as a routine appearance turned into the beginning of a reckoning. Not just for him. But for an entire culture of silence. Because that courtroom wasn't just a place for trials. That day, it became a stage for truth. For exposure. For karma. What he didn't know as he walked past her again with that same dismissive glance was that the chief had already begun gathering records. His name had already been flagged. Complaints he thought had disappeared, resurfaced. And the walls he had built around himself for years, forged in arrogance and protected by policies, were beginning to crack. And it gets worse. Because she didn't just go after him for that one shove. She opened a file. Pulled thread after thread. And what she found was worse than anyone expected. Evidence of misconduct. Patterns of racial profiling. Cases where footage mysteriously disappeared. Statements manipulated. Reports rewritten. And names, so many names of people who had faced him and never stood a chance. But here's the twist. She didn't confront him in anger. She didn't corner him in a hallway. She waited. Waited for the moment that would sting the most. When he was standing tall once again, this time testifying in uniform during a high-profile case. She entered the room not as a guest. Not as an observer. But as the ranking officer in charge. She walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, he looked confused. The judge paused. The attorneys stopped mid-sentence. The room fell into silence once more. She stood in front of him. Eyes locked. And the words that came next didn't just silence the room, they tore the ground out from under his feet. I want the court to be aware that the officer who just testified is currently under internal investigation for abuse of power and racial misconduct. Effective immediately, he is suspended from duty. Badge and weapon, now. His jaw dropped. The courtroom erupted. She didn't flinch. And in that moment, the humiliation returned, only now, it was his. And it didn't come from rage. It came from justice. Measured. Lawful. Undeniable. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly, lets you bury yourself, and when the time is right, it reminds you exactly who you're dealing with. What happened after that left the entire city stunned. But the real question is, what did she do next that no one expected, not even him? Stick around. This story is just getting started. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. We believe in justice, dignity, and respect for all people, on and off the screen. Your experiences matter. Your voice matters. And your presence here means everything. We see you. We hear you. And we support you. Now, let's get into today's powerful story. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and join a community that values truth, justice, and unforgettable twists. Enjoy the story. The air was heavy that morning in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. Thick with southern humidity, but heavier still with the quiet weight of systems that had never truly shifted. The courthouse loomed at the center of downtown like an old monument carved from gray stone, stained by time and countless verdicts. Outside, the sidewalks bustled with lives colliding, defendants pacing in cheap suits, attorneys juggling case files, protesters holding signs no one bothered to read, and officers stationed at every entrance, gripping their belts like it meant something more than protocol. Inside, the cold corridors echoed with the sound of authority, heels, radios, briefcases snapping open, doors slamming shut. It was a stage, and everyone played their part. But no one was watching more closely than the woman walking through the metal detectors with her head high and her heart burning. Her name was Danielle Morgan, and nothing about her presence demanded attention, but everything about her essence commanded it. Early 40s, sharp eyes, rich brown skin, her natural curls tucked into a low, neat bun that whispered discipline without apology. She didn't wear her badge that day, and not because she forgot it. Danielle never forgot anything. She didn't need a symbol to remind anyone who she was. Her presence was the badge. Born and raised on the west side of Birmingham, she had grown up watching her mother balance 3 jobs and her father battle bureaucracy as a union organizer. From the beginning, Danielle had understood 2 things clearly: respect was earned, and justice was never handed out freely, it had to be taken. She entered law enforcement young, barely 21, fueled by the stories her uncles told of injustice, and the statistics that followed young black men like shadows. But it wasn't just passion that made her rise, it was precision. She studied policy like scripture, moved through departments like a storm no one saw coming, and made allies even in silence. Her leadership style was steady, composed, sharp-edged but rooted in fairness. She didn't yell to be heard. She made decisions that couldn't be ignored. And after nearly 2 decades, she shattered a glass ceiling that had quietly suffocated every black woman who had tried before her. She became chief of police. The first in the history of Birmingham. Still, Danielle never let the title blind her to the ground beneath her feet. She knew her appointment didn't change the city, it simply gave her a better view of its fractures. The weight of her badge came not just from leading, but from surviving in a system that still whispered its doubts through gritted teeth and sideways glances. Some officers respected her. Others obeyed out of necessity. And a few, like Officer Jack Corbin, cloaked their disdain in protocol, waiting for moments to reassert control, to challenge silently, to test the limits of her patience. Jack was everything the old system loved. White, mid-40s, confident without cause, born into a family of badge-bearers who treated the uniform like a family heirloom. He wasn't loud about his prejudice. He didn't use slurs or leave written trails. He just acted. Subtle, consistent, insidious. He questioned every command that came from Danielle's office. He rolled his eyes when she walked into precinct meetings. He laughed a little too loud at jokes about affirmative action. And he always had an excuse, always a reason why his behavior wasn't quite punishable. But everyone knew. And Danielle especially. She just waited. The day of the hearing wasn't supposed to be personal. It was a case involving excessive force, one of many that seemed to come across her desk weekly. Danielle didn't need to be there in person, but she chose to go. To observe. To listen. Not as a chief. Not as a superior. But as a woman. A black woman whose presence alone, in that courtroom, carried the weight of generations. She wore civilian clothes, simple slacks, a blouse, and a navy blazer. Nothing that shouted authority. She wanted to be invisible that day, to see without being seen. But for Jack, the sight of her, unbadged, unannounced, was an invitation. She arrived a few minutes after the hearing began, and found the first open row near the front, a section reserved for off-duty officers. She stepped toward the seat and felt it before she even heard it, the hand against her arm, abrupt, dismissive, pushing her back half a step. Not forceful enough to bruise, but sharp enough to shame. His voice followed, clipped and curt, "This row is for active officers, miss. You'll need to move." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes narrowed, not in shock, but in study. He didn't recognize her. Not there. Not like that. She didn't move. So he repeated himself, louder, slower, like she didn't understand English. "I said this is law enforcement seating. Civilian rows are back there." A pause. Then a chuckle from someone behind him. Danielle still didn't speak. But her heart was roaring. There was no apology. No question. No space for dignity in his tone. Just assumption. Entitlement. And the invisible line that told her everything she needed to know, he didn't see her as one of them. Not in that space. Not with that skin. Not in that moment. And in that moment, something inside Danielle shifted. Not rage. Not sorrow. Something deeper. A need for resolution. Not just for herself, but for every time that same hand had been used to push someone else away. She sat 2 rows back, never taking her eyes off the bench. And as the hearing continued, her silence turned into strategy. Jack didn't notice. He didn't even look back. He returned to his post, arms crossed, smug, satisfied that he had kept order in the courtroom. That was who Jack Corbin was. Not the kind of man who lit crosses. But the kind who closed doors without guilt. Who believed racism was a thing of the past because he never paid for it. He had spent years building his own version of loyalty inside the department. He backed other officers in reports, covered when things got too messy, laughed at citizen complaints like they were jokes. And because he never got caught, he believed he never would. Danielle knew otherwise. She had seen his record. Thin on paper, but heavy in whispers. Anonymous tips, dismissed statements, investigations that lacked evidence. She had filed most of them herself. Quietly. Waiting. Because the law was slow. And justice, for people like her, was even slower. But timing was everything. And after that morning, the time had come. Back at her office, Danielle didn't call a meeting. She didn't file a report. She pulled the file. Opened every incident, every discrepancy, every subtle infraction. And one by one, she built the truth. A quiet truth. Not the kind that comes in protests or headlines. But the kind that burns paper by paper, policy by policy, until the whole damn system starts to smell the smoke. And yet, something still haunted her. Not the humiliation. That she had learned to carry since childhood. What haunted her was how natural it had felt to be treated that way. How easy it had been for him to reduce her in front of an entire courtroom. And how none of them, not one, stood to stop it. That silence, it echoed louder than his words. And that silence, more than the shove, became the fuel she needed. She didn't want revenge. She wanted reckoning. Not just for herself, but for every officer of color who had come before her and been told to play the game. For every young woman who had passed the test, earned the title, and still got asked if she was here to clean. For every time the badge didn't shield you because the color of your skin spoke louder than the oath you took. Danielle had no intention of making this private. What began in silence, would end in the open. And Jack Corbin, he had no idea what was coming. Danielle didn't sleep much the night after the courtroom incident. Her apartment, normally a place of calm order and quiet routine, felt tighter than usual, the walls pulsing with unspoken memories and echoes of injustice. She sat on the edge of her bed long after midnight, reviewing every detail from that morning, not because she needed clarity, but because her body hadn't yet caught up to what her mind had already decided. The file on her desk at headquarters was growing heavier by the day, not in physical weight but in consequence. And now, after what happened in that courtroom, it was no longer a question of if, it was a matter of when. When to strike. When to expose. When to pull the mask off the department's best-kept secret. The following week at Central Precinct moved with eerie normalcy, the kind that only deepens unease. Danielle walked the halls like she always did, measured, focused, but behind every nod, every "good morning, Chief," she could feel it. The silent, watching eyes. The half-stifled conversations that stopped when she entered. Even her assistant, Tanya, a sharp and loyal young sergeant, seemed unusually tight-lipped, her fingers twitching nervously over her keyboard. Danielle leaned against her doorframe that Thursday afternoon and asked, "What's going on with you today?" Tanya hesitated, then glanced up. "There's talk. About what happened in court last week." Danielle said nothing, just folded her arms and waited. Tanya continued. "People are saying Officer Corbin was out of line. That he might have known who you were and did it anyway." Danielle's eyes didn't flinch. "And do you believe that?" Tanya nodded slowly. "I think he knew. I think he's done it before. I think you scared the hell out of him by staying quiet." Danielle smiled, not from amusement, but from recognition. "Good. Let them talk. Let him sweat." At the same time, Jack Corbin wasn't sweating. Not yet. In fact, he was bragging. Down in the locker room, over stale vending machine coffee and between boasts about his time in narcotics, he recounted the incident like a joke. "Some woman tried to sit in our row," he chuckled to two younger officers. "Didn't even have a badge showing. I said, Back of the room, sweetheart. You should have seen the look on her face. One of the officers raised an eyebrow. That wasn't the chief, was it? Jack shrugged. So what if it was? She wasn't in uniform. No badge. I don't have to kiss her ass just because she wears a title. The other officer tried to laugh, but his expression faded. She's not someone you want to mess with, man. Jack leaned back, smug. I've been here longer than she's even had a badge. She plays power games, I play survival. Let's see who wins. But Jack underestimated something deeper than hierarchy. He underestimated how many people had been watching. How many people had filed away little moments, little slights, little shifts in his tone when speaking to officers of color. And now, with Danielle's quiet lead, they were starting to come forward. It started with a young officer named Kendra Fields. She knocked on Danielle's office door late one evening after everyone else had gone home. Her hands shook slightly as she held a folder. I wasn't going to say anything, she whispered, but after what I heard happened. I can't keep quiet. Inside the folder were 2 incident reports, one from a domestic call where Jack had rewritten the victim's statement, and another from a routine stop that had ended with a teenager in cuffs and no official explanation. Danielle read them slowly, her jaw tense. Why now? She asked. Kendra blinked. Because I saw what he did to you, Chief. And if he can do that to you, there's no safety for the rest of us. That was all Danielle needed. Over the next 2 weeks, testimonies began to trickle in. Quiet conversations behind closed doors. Anonymous notes slipped under her door. Patterns emerged. Names repeated. Moments that had once seemed isolated now wove themselves into a larger, more dangerous web. And still, she said nothing publicly. She needed time. Precision. She met with internal affairs behind coded appointments. She cross-referenced body cam footage with written reports. She consulted legal advisors in whispers. And she never once let Jack know how close the fire was getting. But Jack started to sense it anyway. At first, it was just the looks. Then it was the reassigned patrols. Then it was the silence in meetings, the way people no longer laughed at his comments, the way his jokes landed flat, the way even his own captain began to avoid his calls. He went home one night and found his mailbox filled with empty envelopes. No return address. No notes. Just air. He stormed into work the next day, slamming his badge on his desk. Is this some kind of joke? He shouted. Danielle looked up from her paperwork, calm and composed. Excuse me. Jack threw one of the envelopes at her. This. The silence. The games. What the hell's going on? Danielle blinked once, then stood up slowly. Are you accusing me of something, Officer Corbin? He froze. For the first time, the power shifted in the room. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. But her tone sliced through the air like a blade. Because if you are, I suggest you choose your next words carefully. Jack said nothing. Danielle sat back down. Then I suggest you get back to your duties. He turned and left. But his hands trembled. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. And the hearing loomed, one of the biggest public cases the department had faced all year. A corruption trial involving a city councilman and a few rogue cops caught laundering funds through fake overtime shifts. Jack had been called to testify, not because he was implicated, but because he had once overseen patrols linked to the area. It was supposed to be routine. Simple questions. A few clarifications. But Danielle knew it was the perfect moment. She hadn't just gathered evidence, she'd built a case. A bulletproof one. And she didn't need a press release or a dramatic confrontation. She needed a moment that couldn't be spun, denied, or ignored. A moment that would land like a thunderclap. In front of judges. Lawyers. The public. The press. A moment where truth wouldn't whisper, it would roar. The night before the hearing, she reviewed the files again. Alone in her office, surrounded by stacks of paper and digital folders, she allowed herself one moment of vulnerability. Her fingers paused over an old photo on her desk, her parents standing outside their small house, proud smiles despite the struggle. Her mother's eyes looked just like hers. Tired but unbroken. She whispered, "It's time." The next morning, Danielle didn't wear her uniform. She wore a dark navy suit, the same one she'd worn the day she was sworn in. Her badge, however, was clipped visibly to her hip. No mistakes this time. No misidentification. She walked into the courthouse not as a guest, not as a spectator, but as the highest-ranking officer in the city. The courtroom buzzed with low chatter. Jack stood at the witness bench, posture perfect, expression smug. He hadn't seen her yet. But everyone else had. Heads turned. Whispers spread like fire. She took a seat in the front row. And waited. Because what she was about to do, what she had planned, wasn't just going to remove Jack Corbin from the force. It was going to expose him in a way he never saw coming. What she had discovered would not only ruin his career, it would force the entire department to face the rot it had buried for years. And just when he thought he was standing tall in the light of justice, Danielle was about to pull the ground right out from beneath him. What she knew, what she held in her hands, was bigger than revenge, it was accountability. But what exactly did she find? And how was she going to reveal it? "You're not ready for what's coming next." The courtroom was colder than usual, the air conditioning humming low but sharp, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Sunlight spilled through the high windows, slashing across the benches like spotlights on a stage, casting shadows that made everything feel more dramatic than it already was. Jack sat at the witness stand with a confidence that had been built not from honor or merit, but from years of never being questioned. He smoothed his tie with slow precision, glanced at the judge, and answered the first few questions with that same practiced ease he'd perfected over decades of skating above consequence. His voice was steady, calculated, familiar to anyone who'd worked with him, a voice that knew just how far to go without crossing lines, the voice of a man who believed his power was permanent. Danielle sat in the front row, her expression unreadable, her presence undeniable. There were murmurs when she entered earlier, subtle ripples of tension that spread across the room like a low tremor. Attorneys exchanged looks, officers shifted in their seats, even the judge hesitated slightly before continuing. No one expected her to be there, not in uniform, not with that stance, not with that file in her lap. But she didn't look at Jack right away. She watched the room instead. The attorneys. The spectators. The jury. She studied them like pieces in a system she knew better than anyone. And when the prosecutor paused to introduce his next witness, her former subordinate, she finally looked up. Jack didn't see her at first. He was mid-sentence, spinning a safe version of the truth, positioning himself as the reliable observer, the seasoned professional who just happened to be nearby during a financial crime investigation. But when the prosecutor thanked him and began to move on, Danielle stood. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to command silence. She walked toward the bench, her heels sharp against the polished floor, her badge glinting like a warning shot. The room froze. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm but resonant, "before this witness is dismissed, I'd like to present new information relevant to his credibility." The judge blinked. "Chief Morgan, are you part of this case's prosecution?" Danielle nodded once. "In my capacity as Chief of Police, I have submitted evidence to Internal Affairs regarding Officer Corbin that directly impacts his testimony." She turned to the clerk, handed over the sealed folder, and stepped back without a word. Jack's face shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. But the edges of his confidence began to twitch. His lips parted, then closed again. He glanced toward the defense table, then to the judge, as if silently pleading for this moment to pass. It didn't. The judge adjusted his glasses and read through the documents silently for nearly a full minute. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and thick. Then came the first question. "Officer Corbin," the judge said slowly, "are you aware that your body cam footage from the Westmont arrest in March 2022 was manually edited before being uploaded to the system?" Jack hesitated. "That was reviewed already, sir." The footage glitched. "That was documented." The judge didn't look up. The footage was recovered in full from the device itself. The portion missing from the uploaded file contains you threatening an unarmed suspect, followed by use of force that was omitted from your report. He paused. "You submitted that report under oath." Jack's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Danielle stepped forward again. "This is one of 3 incidents, Your Honor. All with similar patterns. Edited footage, manipulated reports, unnecessary force used primarily against black suspects. I've also included internal complaints from officers who witnessed or reported this behavior and were ignored or retaliated against." The room stirred. A murmur swelled among the gallery. Whispers, disbelief, gasps. Danielle remained still. Calm. Her eyes on Jack. The judge's voice sharpened. "Officer Corbin, do you deny altering these records?" Jack gripped the railing of the witness stand. "I did what I had to do in the field. These people, these situations, they escalate quickly. We make judgment calls." Danielle cut in. "No one here is judging your instinct, officer. We're judging your integrity. And your pattern shows a history of targeting minorities, covering your actions, and mocking the process that's supposed to protect them." Her voice stayed measured, but each word hit with precision. "You didn't just bend the rules. You erased people's lives from the paperwork. And you thought no one would ever put the pieces together." Jack's face drained of color. "This is personal," he spat. "You're doing this to humiliate me." Danielle stepped closer, just enough that her voice lowered into something everyone still heard. "You humiliated yourself the day you decided the badge made you untouchable. I'm just here to show the truth." The judge raised his hand. "That's enough." He turned to the prosecutor. "This court will move to suspend Officer Corbin's testimony until these allegations are fully reviewed. He is hereby removed as a witness. And I'm referring this matter to the Oversight Board for immediate internal investigation." Jack stood. For the first time, visibly rattled. "You're going to believe her over me? After everything I've done for this department?" The judge didn't respond. Danielle did. "You didn't serve the department. You served yourself. You wore the uniform like a shield, not a responsibility. And now, the uniform won't protect you." As bailiffs approached to escort him out for formal review, Jack turned to Danielle. His voice cracked. "You think this makes you better than me? You think exposing me fixes anything?" Danielle held his gaze, unwavering. "No. It doesn't fix everything. But it starts something. Something this department's needed for a long time." The doors opened. Jack stepped through them, now small, now uncertain, now stripped of the myth he'd built around himself. And as he disappeared from the room, Danielle stood silently, the courtroom still frozen in the weight of what had just unfolded. Outside, reporters had already begun to gather. Word spread fast. Headlines would soon follow. But inside, what mattered most wasn't the scandal, it was the shift. The silence had finally been broken. But what the courtroom still didn't know, was that Danielle wasn't finished. Because in that folder, there was one more name. A name no one expected. And when she reveals who else was complicit in protecting Jack Corbin, the city will never see law enforcement the same way again. The door shut behind Jack with a low, deliberate thud, but the silence it left behind was anything but calm. It was charged, crackling with something no one in that courtroom could quite put into words yet. Some shifted in their seats, some stared down at the floor, and some looked straight at Danielle, waiting. Waiting to see if that was it. If that was the end. But it wasn't. Danielle remained standing, not out of dramatics, but because she wasn't finished. Her gaze moved toward the judge once more, her voice composed but heavy with finality. She lifted the second folder, the one she hadn't touched until now, and laid it on the clerk's table without saying a word. The judge raised an eyebrow. "There's more." Danielle didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor." Officer Corbin was not acting alone. His misconduct wasn't a one-man operation. It was enabled, overlooked, and in some cases, directly protected by individuals in leadership roles who chose silence over accountability. There was a stir in the back of the courtroom. Defense attorneys, prosecution staff, a few officers in uniform, heads turned sharply. A beat passed, and then another. The judge leaned forward. "Go on." Danielle walked to the center of the room, turning to face the gallery. Corbin's actions went unchecked for years not because they were invisible, but because they were inconvenient to confront. Multiple internal complaints were redirected, flagged as resolved without proper investigation, or buried under technicalities. In several of those cases, one name continued to appear in the communication chain: Deputy Chief Alan Reeves. A sharp intake of breath shot across the room. Reeves wasn't just a name, he was a fixture in the department. The kind of leader people rarely questioned, the kind who stayed just far enough removed from scandal to keep his hands clean, while ensuring the system stayed predictable. He wasn't in the courtroom at that moment, but the impact of his name being spoken aloud was immediate. It felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under everyone. Danielle continued, her voice growing more personal. Reeves was present in internal review meetings where Corbin's cases were discussed. He signed off on dismissals of multiple officer reports without adequate explanation. In one instance, he overruled a proposed suspension citing lack of cultural sensitivity training as a more appropriate response than discipline. That same case involved a teenage boy thrown to the ground, choked, and left in a holding cell for over 7 hours without charge. Murmurs rose again. The judge looked down at the file, flipping pages, the crease between his brows deepening. Danielle stepped aside so the documents could be reviewed. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't seek validation. Her focus was surgical. She was cutting into the very bones of the institution that had allowed men like Corbin to thrive and calling out the ones who had kept the wound from healing. Moments later, the judge cleared his throat. "We will request Deputy Chief Reeves be summoned immediately for questioning. These documents will be entered into the official court record. I trust Internal Affairs has already been notified." Danielle nodded. "They have. And they've already opened a formal investigation as of this morning." A pause. Then, for the first time, someone in the back stood. It was Officer Kendra Fields, the young officer who had first come to Danielle weeks before. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "Chief, if you hadn't come forward, if you hadn't stood up in there, we'd still be taking orders from him." Danielle turned slowly, her eyes meeting Kendra's. There was something unspoken in that moment, recognition, strength, shared exhaustion. Danielle's voice lowered, but every word was deliberate. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here to remind this department of what it was supposed to stand for." Another officer stood. Then another. One by one, silent at first, but present. It wasn't a protest, or a spectacle, it was solidarity. The kind that comes when fear begins to give way to hope. Danielle didn't smile. Not yet. There was still too much to uncover. But she allowed herself a breath, a full, deep one, because she knew the tide had finally begun to turn. She left the courtroom not to applause or cheers, but to quiet reverence. Journalists rushed forward, flashes popped, microphones extended, but she walked through them like smoke, unfazed. A young black girl standing on the sidewalk with her father looked up as she passed. Danielle caught her eyes, and the girl whispered something to her father. Danielle didn't hear the words, but she saw the look in the father's eyes as he nodded, pride, maybe. Relief. Back at headquarters, the atmosphere was electric. The story had already hit the local news and was beginning to spread. Phones rang off the hook. Internal Affairs had already called an emergency session. And for the first time in years, officers were filing into Danielle's office voluntarily, not with excuses or complaints, but with stories. Evidence. Testimonies. Sergeant Carla Barnes, a no-nonsense veteran of the department who had always kept her head down, stepped in and closed the door behind her. "I've got emails," she said. "One's Reeves sent me to block disciplinary reviews. I was scared to say anything before, but after what you did in that courtroom," Danielle took the flash drive, her voice softer now. "Thank you. This matters more than you know." Carla shook her head. "No, Chief. You matter more than you know." The days that followed were a blur of legal movement, press inquiries, and high-level meetings. Reeves was summoned, confronted, suspended pending further investigation. His denial was swift, his lawyer aggressive, but the evidence had weight now. Too many people speaking. Too many files matching. Too many ghosts finally being given names. Danielle found herself alone late one night again, this time in the briefing room, staring at the wall of commendations. Some were hers. Some belonged to officers long retired. And some, she now knew, belonged to people who never deserved them. She stood there for a long time, until the silence became memory. Then she heard footsteps behind her. It was Tanya, her assistant. Tanya leaned against the doorway. "We've had 6 officers request transfer to your division in the last 2 days." Danielle turned, eyebrow raised. "All of them black?" Tanya smiled faintly. "All of them good?" Danielle nodded. "Keep the list. We're going to need strong people." Tanya hesitated, then added, "You know, you didn't just expose a man. You exposed a disease." Danielle looked back at the wall. "Diseases don't kill institutions. Silence does." The phone on the wall rang once. Then twice. Tanya answered it, then handed it over. "Press wants a statement." Danielle took the phone, paused, then said only one thing. "Tell them I'll speak when the system starts listening." As she hung up, she knew what would come next: backlash, resistance, legal threats, more nights without sleep, but she also knew this was the only way forward. And something about that made her feel more alive than she had in years. Because for the first time, accountability wasn't just a word. It had a face. Her face. But still, deep in the pit of her gut, she could feel it. Something unresolved, something even bigger was about to surface, and when it did, it wouldn't just change the department, it would change everything Danielle thought she knew about her past, because there was one more file she hadn't opened yet, one with her name on it. The days that followed were not quiet. The silence that had blanketed the department before was gone, replaced by a storm of movement, noise, and reaction. Danielle found herself at the center of a hurricane that she had unleashed but could no longer control with mere strength of will. The city buzzed with the fallout, news stations lined the steps of precinct buildings, interviews ran on repeat with experts analyzing the implications of her testimony, and community leaders gathered on air to debate whether what had happened was justice or simply a long overdue reckoning. Yet beneath all of it, Danielle moved with a strange calm, like the eye of that storm, surrounded by chaos but untouched, at least on the surface. Inside headquarters, everything had changed. Officers who once barely acknowledged her presence now met her eyes with something resembling respect, or maybe fear. Danielle couldn't tell which. What she did know was that things didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Corbin had been removed. Reeves had been suspended. But systems don't collapse overnight. They buckle slowly, at the corners first, where no one's looking. And Danielle could feel those corners creaking. The weight of it was immense. Paperwork came in floods. Internal Affairs demanded more documentation. Civilian complaints flooded her desk. And from above, city officials began requesting updates under the guise of support, their voices laced with anxiety over what else might emerge. Danielle spent late nights in her office, lit only by the glow of her laptop and the buzzing fluorescence overhead. She barely slept. Barely ate. It wasn't that she couldn't, it was that something inside her wouldn't allow it. Not while the work remained unfinished. And yet, that file. The one she hadn't touched yet. The one with her own name on it. It sat untouched in the bottom drawer of her desk, locked behind a key only she held. She hadn't opened it for one reason, because everything she had done so far had been rooted in her sense of control, and that file threatened it. Not because it was dangerous, but because it held a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. Then came the call. It was early morning. Danielle was still in uniform from the night before, her jacket draped over the back of the chair, tie loosened, eyes heavy but focused. The phone rang once, twice, and she answered out of reflex more than intention. The voice on the other end was low, cautious. "Chief Morgan, this is Carla Barnes. I think you need to come downstairs." Danielle sat up. "Why? What is it?" "It's about the case. There's someone here. Claims to have information, about you. About Reeves. About everything." For a long second, Danielle didn't speak. Then she stood, slipped her jacket back on, and walked out the door. Downstairs, in the waiting area just past the metal detectors, sat a man she hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. Marcus Dunn. A former detective, one she had trained with early in her career. He looked older now, gray streaks in his beard, eyes tired, but there was a sharpness to his posture that hadn't dulled. When he saw her, he stood, nodding respectfully. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he began. Danielle folded her arms. "Then why are you here, Marcus?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Because I was part of it. Back then. When Reeves started cleaning up reports, burying misconduct. I didn't know how far it went. Not until I saw your name." She didn't take the envelope. "My name?" He nodded. "In 2010, you reported misconduct in a narcotics case. Officer Willis, remember?" She did. Vividly. A young black man had been beaten during a search. Danielle had filed a complaint, backed by a witness statement. The report vanished within a week. She was told it had been resolved. She never saw any disciplinary action. It had haunted her for years. Marcus continued. "Reeves buried that report. Labeled you as a liability in internal memos. Said you were too emotional to be objective. That's why you were reassigned so often early on. You weren't moving up. You were being pushed sideways." The room tilted slightly. Danielle felt it not in her body, but in her mind, a slow, nauseating realization that all the struggles she'd endured early in her career hadn't been the cost of being black or being a woman in uniform. They'd been the cost of telling the truth. Marcus placed the envelope on the table. "That's your original complaint. The one Reeves erased. I kept a copy. I was scared back then. We all were." Danielle stared at it, her voice lower now. "Why now?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because watching you stand up in that courtroom made me realize I've been a coward for too long. And I'm tired of being afraid of men who pretend their power makes them righteous." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He turned to leave, then paused. "Whatever you decide to do with it, just know, you weren't wrong. You were never wrong." Back in her office, Danielle sat with the envelope in front of her. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she stared at it like it was a mirror. Everything she had uncovered about Corbin and Reeves had been about them. About their abuse. Their corruption. But this was about her. About the ways she had been shaped by lies. It wasn't just about being excluded. It was about being manipulated into believing that her setbacks were her fault. Later that afternoon, she called an emergency meeting with the department's executive board. The room was full: commanders, legal advisors, IA reps, union liaisons. Danielle stood at the head of the table, the envelope in her hand. "I've received evidence that former Deputy Chief Reeves not only enabled misconduct but intentionally suppressed whistleblowers within this department," she began. "I was one of them." Gasps rippled down the table. Danielle kept going. For over a decade, reports were tampered with. Officers who spoke up were reassigned, demoted, or silenced. This is not just about bad cops. This is about a culture that rewarded silence and punished conscience. Someone spoke up, an older commander, skeptical. "And you're prepared to testify to this? Even implicating yourself?" Danielle's eyes didn't waver. "Absolutely. If I expect others to be accountable, I have to be too." The room went quiet. Then another voice, a younger commander, one who had always supported her, said, "Then we're behind you. Whatever comes next." Outside that room, the city buzzed louder than ever. Protesters gathered, not in anger this time, but in support. Danielle's name had become a chant, a symbol, a rallying cry. But she didn't bask in it. She knew it could vanish just as fast. Integrity isn't built in the spotlight, it's tested when no one's looking. That night, as she walked to her car alone, she passed a mural. It hadn't been there the week before. It was her. Not in uniform, not smiling. Just her face, serious, watchful. Underneath, someone had written, "Truth doesn't need permission." Danielle stopped, stared, and felt the weight of everything settle. The trials weren't over. The department would be dragged through months of inquiry. Her own past would be scrutinized. And Reeves, he would fight back. But none of it mattered now the same way it had before. Because now, she knew the truth didn't just belong in reports or courtrooms. It belonged in the open. And now that it was finally there, she could see something she hadn't seen in years. The beginning of an end. And the start of something new. It wasn't until the third week of hearings that Danielle began to feel the true cost of what she had started. The media attention hadn't slowed, it had intensified. Each new headline dug deeper into the roots of the department's rot, and each day another piece of buried truth surfaced. But the more the public rallied, the more some from inside the walls of her own building began to retreat. Loyalty had become a shifting current, one that changed with every revelation. Some officers were still with her, steady and bold, their support unwavering. Others watched from the sidelines, eyes cautious, calculating which side history would favor. And then there were those who turned, officers who had once stood beside her in meetings, shared handshakes and words of solidarity, now whispering behind closed doors or leaking half-truths to the press to protect themselves. It wasn't betrayal, not exactly. It was fear. Danielle recognized it in their posture, in their silence, in the way they avoided her gaze in the hallways. She didn't hate them for it, but she didn't excuse it either. She had lived too long in the consequences of silence to pretend it didn't cause damage. One morning, as she stepped into the precinct lobby, she found Sergeant Leon Whitaker waiting for her. He had been on the force for nearly 30 years, a stoic man who rarely spoke unless necessary. He stood with his hands behind his back, his eyes scanning her like he was measuring the weight of her choices. "Morning, Chief," he said, voice low. "Morning, Sergeant," she replied, not breaking stride. "I heard about Reeves. About the files. About the early years," he added, his tone less formal now. "Back then, we all saw what was happening. We just didn't know how to stop it without getting eaten alive." Danielle turned to him fully, her voice quiet but steady. "You didn't stop it, Leon. That's the part you have to live with." He didn't flinch. "I know. That's why I'm here." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small drive. Internal training logs from 2012 through 2016. Redacted back then, but I saved the originals. You might want to look at the signatures. She stared at the drive in her palm. Why now? Because watching you stand up there reminded me of what I used to believe in, he said. And because I've got 2 granddaughters who need to know their grandfather wasn't just a bystander. She didn't thank him, not with words. She nodded once, tucked the drive into her coat, and continued on. Because she knew the weight of real change didn't come with applause, it came with evidence. Later that day, she met with the city's Civilian Review Board. The panel was tense, wary, each member shuffling papers and exchanging glances. Their expressions told her everything. This wasn't going to be a friendly discussion. It wasn't personal, but it wasn't trusting either. They were under pressure, too. From city officials, from unions, from donors, from voters. They weren't sure whether Danielle was a hero or a liability. Chief Morgan, began Chairwoman Denise Holloway, while we recognize the progress made under your leadership, we're receiving concerns about the department's stability. Morale among officers is reportedly at an all-time low. Several supervisors have expressed frustration with ongoing investigations, claiming it's interfering with daily operations. Danielle didn't blink. Corruption should interfere with operations. That's the point. Denise leaned forward. We're not here to argue the importance of accountability. But we need to ask, how do you plan to rebuild trust? Not just with the public, but within your own team. Danielle took a breath, one that felt like lifting bricks off her chest. By not backing down. Trust doesn't return because you slow down the truth. It returns because people see you're willing to face the worst parts of what you represent and still keep going. That's leadership. And that's how you fix what's broken. A pause. Then one of the younger board members, a man named Terrence, who had remained quiet, spoke. I used to be a community advocate. Fought against the department for years. Never thought I'd sit across from a chief and think, maybe it's possible. But what happens when this ends, Chief Morgan? When the headlines fade? What's the legacy? Danielle looked at him without hesitation. A department that listens more than it defends. Officers who know the badge is earned every day, not just once in training. And a generation that grows up seeing someone like me in this role and understands that authority doesn't have to mean oppression. The board didn't respond immediately. They just looked at her. Some with admiration. Some with doubt. All of them, listening. That evening, Danielle returned home to find her mother waiting on the porch. She hadn't called. She hadn't warned her. She was just there, sitting with a calm that had always made Danielle feel 10 years old again. Her mother stood as she approached and opened her arms, no words, just embrace. Danielle let herself be held, let the armor fall away for a moment, let the weight of all those decisions slip just enough to feel the exhaustion beneath. Inside, over tea, her mother finally spoke. You always knew what kind of fight this would be. Danielle nodded. Yeah. I just didn't know how lonely it would feel. Her mother gave a small, sad smile. Real change always feels lonely. That's how you know it's real. The people you need to reach aren't clapping, they're thinking. Danielle looked down at her cup. There's still more. Still more names, more files. I don't even know how deep it goes. You don't have to know how deep, her mother said gently. You just have to keep walking. And so she did. The next morning brought another wave of attention, this time from the mayor's office. A private meeting was called. Danielle arrived early, dressed in plain clothes, not the uniform. She wanted them to speak to her as a person, not as a symbol. Mayor Rosenthal greeted her with a handshake too firm to be sincere. Danielle, we've got to talk about optics. Danielle raised an eyebrow. That's what we're calling justice now. The mayor didn't smile. There's pressure coming from state-level offices. Political backers are worried. They're saying your methods are too aggressive. Too public. Too destabilizing. Danielle crossed her arms. You mean I'm finally making them feel uncomfortable? Look, the mayor said, his voice lowering, we both know what you've done here is unprecedented. But you're pushing fast. Hard. Some people are wondering if you're trying to burn the whole thing down. Danielle leaned in. Maybe that's because it needs to burn. Maybe what we've been calling a department is really just a machine running on fear and silence. If that makes people uncomfortable, then good. Because they should be. The mayor sighed. Just, be careful. They're looking for a reason to stop you. Danielle stood. They had their chance. And they didn't. Back at the precinct, Tanya met her with an urgent look. Chief, there's something you need to see. Danielle followed her into her office, where an email sat open on her screen. Attached were photos. Records. A scan of a document Danielle hadn't seen before, another suppressed report, this one filed by a rookie officer 3 years ago. The accused? Reeves. But what caught Danielle's breath was the signature at the bottom of the case closed form. It was hers. Her own name. Her own initials. Tanya looked at her carefully. It must have been forged. Right? Danielle stared at the screen. The date lined up with a time she'd been overseas on assignment. There was no way she had signed it. But the signature was perfect. A copy of something taken from another form. Manipulated. Used against her. She leaned back, the weight of it sinking in. This wasn't just about exposure anymore. It was war. And her own name, her own credibility, was now a target. The question wasn't just how much she was willing to uncover, it was how much she was willing to risk and whether the truth would still matter once they tried to turn it against her. Danielle sat in her office long after the precinct had emptied, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the walls. Her signature stared back at her from the screen, familiar yet foreign. There was a quiet violence in what she was looking at, a perfect forgery, crafted to mirror her handwriting down to the pressure on the last stroke. But she knew with certainty she hadn't signed that report. The timestamp placed her on a different continent, part of a federal task force initiative in South Africa at the time. Yet here it was, indisputable evidence, intentionally planted, timed, and revealed at a critical moment when her credibility was the sharpest tool she had left. The room felt smaller, the silence oppressive. She exhaled slowly, but the breath didn't bring relief. She closed the file and leaned back, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Tanya had left an hour ago, reluctant but obedient when Danielle told her to go home and get some rest. She didn't need Tanya to see her like this, worn, frayed, teetering at the edge of an abyss she hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. Her phone buzzed with another message, then another. Reporters. Legal teams. Internal affairs. Friends pretending to be neutral. Enemies pretending to be friends. She turned the screen face down and stood. In the small cabinet behind her desk, she pulled out a bottle of water and a file labeled only with a red X. This was the collection of evidence she hadn't shared with anyone yet, not even Tanya. It contained all the pieces that didn't fit neatly into the public narrative. Hints of a deeper conspiracy, whispers of larger payouts, references to donors and developers with interests tied to the silence of the police department. She had been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment to use it. But now she wondered if there would even be a right moment left. The knock on the door startled her. It was almost midnight. She walked over, expecting security or maybe another reporter who'd somehow slipped past. Instead, it was Marcus Dunn. She opened the door. I didn't expect you. Marcus nodded. I figured. Come in. He stepped inside slowly, glancing around. You look like you haven't slept in a week. I haven't, she said flatly, then added, I assume you're not here for small talk. Marcus sighed and dropped a manila folder onto her desk. I wasn't sure I should bring this to you. But after what Tanya showed me earlier today, I realized you need to see it. Danielle opened the folder. Inside were transcripts, typed conversations, email printouts, and 2 photocopied documents stamped, confidential. Her eyes scanned the pages quickly. At first, it seemed like more of the same, cover-ups, suppressed files, political interference. But then she saw her name again, this time in an email thread between Reeves and a private legal advisor. The email was short, clipped, but devastating. Push it through. If Morgan gets too far, this buys us time to discredit. The signature's already in. She froze. Marcus, this proves they forged it deliberately. It wasn't just to protect themselves. They planned to destroy me. He nodded slowly. They knew what you were going to become before you did. And they made sure they had a weapon ready. Danielle sat down again. Her body felt heavy. If this goes public now, it'll turn the whole investigation sideways. Everyone will focus on me. Not the evidence. Not the victims. Me. Marcus leaned against the wall. Maybe. But if you hide it, and they drop it first, they control the story. You'll look like you were covering your own tracks. Danielle didn't speak. She just stared at the folder, the weight of the decision pressing against her like gravity. It was a trap either way. Say nothing, and risk being exposed on their terms. Speak first, and risk derailing everything she'd fought for. Either way, the spotlight would turn. And the justice she had so carefully built for others would feel like a weapon turned inward. Do you regret it? Marcus asked, voice gentler now. She looked up, confused. Regret what? Starting all this. Tearing it down. Telling the truth. She was quiet for a long moment. No. I regret not starting sooner. He smiled, just barely. That's why you're the one who had to do it. The next day arrived with headlines she hadn't expected. Word had leaked, not about the forged signature, but about the internal infighting between department heads, including whispers that some were considering a no-confidence vote against her leadership. The idea that the system she defended, while exposing its darkest corners, might now turn against her wasn't new. But now it was in motion. Danielle met with her legal team at sunrise, briefed the communications office, and prepared for the inevitable press conference that would come by sundown. Still, she hadn't made a decision about the forged report. Not yet. That afternoon, she stood before the Department Oversight Committee, a panel of 8, seated in a long curved table like judges, every one of them expressionless as she entered. She had testified in front of them before, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Hostile. Pre-written. She sat when directed, refusing to adjust the microphone or shuffle her notes. Every motion was deliberate. Controlled. One of the senior board members, Councilwoman Graves, leaned forward. Chief Morgan, recent developments have caused concern regarding your ability to maintain impartial leadership during an ongoing investigation that now appears to have encircled your own actions, specifically a 2010 report bearing your signature. Can you speak to that? Danielle met her eyes. Yes. I did not sign that report. I was not in the country at the time. The document was forged. Another board member raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof? Yes, Danielle answered, lifting the email thread Marcus had brought her. And I have evidence that the forgery was not just incidental. It was calculated. Designed to be used against me when I became a threat to those trying to bury departmental misconduct. Gasps rippled through the chamber, but Danielle didn't pause. I've held this evidence because I knew how it would be used, twisted, politicized. I chose not to expose it until I could confirm its source. Now I can. A younger board member leaned in. Why now? Because if I ask others to stand in their truth, I can't hide from mine. There was silence. Then Graves spoke again. "Chief Morgan, what do you expect us to do with this?" Danielle folded her hands. "I don't expect you to protect me. I expect you to protect the truth." As she left the building, cameras swarmed her, reporters shouting over one another. "Chief Morgan, are you stepping down? Is this the end of your reform efforts? Did you forge the document? Do you blame yourself? What do you say to your critics?" She didn't stop. She walked past all of them, straight to the car where Tanya waited, door open. Once inside, Tanya looked at her with quiet eyes. "Do you think they believe you?" she asked. Danielle exhaled. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Tanya whispered. Danielle turned, looked out the window, and saw the faces of citizens holding signs, some with her name, some just with the word truth. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a loss. It was the middle of the war. And it wasn't over. Not yet. The weeks that followed didn't feel like a victory. They felt like aftermath. Like waking up in the stillness after a storm that destroyed more than it rebuilt. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the winds shifted. The city council launched an independent inquiry that validated every claim Danielle had brought forward. Forensic analysts confirmed the forgery of her signature, matching it to a template used in other documents tied to the former deputy chief's office. The Oversight Committee, once cautious and politically neutral, voted unanimously not only to clear Danielle of all wrongdoing, but to install a permanent civilian review board under her authority. It was a quiet moment of vindication. Not a celebration, but a breath of something close to peace. Alan Reeves was formally indicted on charges of obstruction of justice, tampering with official documents, and conspiracy to defraud the city. During his arraignment, he barely looked up from the floor. The man who once orchestrated power behind closed doors now stood stripped of every title and shield he had weaponized for decades. As the proceedings unfolded, former officers who had been complicit began to fall, their retirements revoked, pensions frozen, and names etched into the public record not as heroes, but as proof that silence is never neutral. Jack Corbin, already suspended, faced additional charges tied to excessive force and tampered body cam footage. His attorney tried to spin the narrative, blaming stress, poor supervision, even cultural misunderstandings, but the court didn't buy it. When the verdict came, Danielle didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. Justice, in this case, didn't come from witnessing punishment. It came from knowing that the truth had finally spoken louder than the fear. Inside the department, something shifted in a way Danielle could feel before she could measure it. It wasn't just in the new hires, the transparency policies, or the mandated reviews, it was in the energy of the people walking the halls. Young officers began referring to her not just as chief, but as leader. They came to her not to avoid accountability, but to seek clarity, to learn. Officer Kendra Fields was promoted to head the newly formed Equity and Conduct Unit, leading training and investigations focused on bias and internal culture. Tanya received a city honor for integrity and service after an anonymous citizen tipped off the mayor's office about her role in protecting the truth. Marcus Dunn, who once feared stepping back into a system he thought broken beyond repair, was offered a senior advisor position. He declined, choosing instead to start a nonprofit focused on mentoring at-risk youth who had been affected by police violence. But it was Danielle who remained at the center, not as a symbol of one person's victory, but as the anchor for a movement that had finally grown roots. One morning, standing on the same courthouse steps where she had once been shoved and dismissed, she looked out at a crowd gathered not for protest, but for acknowledgement. It was a department ceremony, quiet, respectful, no fanfare. As she stepped to the podium, a breeze moved through the crowd, carrying with it the sounds of children playing in the distance and the low murmur of a city trying to learn from its scars. Her speech was brief, as always, but this time, it was not just measured. It was personal. She spoke of the difference between change and transformation. Of how justice isn't an endpoint but a discipline. She spoke of her mother, who had once cleaned houses just blocks from that very courthouse. Of the nights she sat awake, wondering if dignity and power could ever coexist in the same body when that body was black and female. And of how the answer, she discovered, was yes, but only if it was chosen over and over, even when it hurt. Even when it cost everything. As she stepped down from the podium, a small group of young black girls ran up to her. They weren't part of any organization, just daughters of officers, community leaders, everyday citizens. One of them tugged on her sleeve and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Danielle knelt, looked her in the eye, and answered, "Be better than me. Start from truth. Don't wait to be given permission." Later that evening, back in her apartment, Danielle stood in front of a mirror. She had changed. Not just in posture or expression, but in essence. The weight of betrayal, the sting of isolation, the echo of every room she once walked into unrecognized, none of it had disappeared. But it had transformed. It had become purpose. She no longer moved through the world needing to prove who she was. She moved through it determined to protect what she had become. So what can we take from Danielle's story? Maybe it's this, that truth doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't roar. It knocks softly, waits in corners, and asks if you're ready to carry the cost of letting it in. Maybe it teaches us that strength isn't found in how loud you speak, but in how long you're willing to stand when no one else is standing with you. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us that justice isn't some distant mountain reserved for heroes. It's a quiet, relentless climb, often made by people who are tired, afraid, and still choose to climb anyway. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story struck you the most? Was it Danielle's patience? Her courage? The system that tried to silence her? Or the moment she refused to let it win? Let's talk about it in the comments. Share your thoughts, your truth, your experience. Because stories like this don't just belong to the people in them, they belong to all of us. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of something you needed to feel again, then I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, real, and unforgettable stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal what's possible when one voice dares to speak up. We'll be waiting for you in the next twist.